Studies, School of Humanities. I, Vinaya Ballakor, welcome you all to Sri Gunturu Sheshendra Sharma Endowment Lecture for Sanskrit, endowed by Srimati Rajkumari Indra Devi Dhanraj Girji in memory of her husband. On this occasion, we have an invited lecture on the fifth Puruṣārtha by Professor Sudipta Kaviraj. Jagadishwar Raoji, Vice Chancellor, University of Hyderabad, to preside over the event by his presence today. I request Srimati Rajkumari Indra Devi Dhanraj Girji, wife of Sri Gunturu Sheshendra Sharma Garu, to preside and welcome you, ma'am. And now I request Professor V. Krishna Garu, Dean, School of Humanities, to take his seat on the dais. Please, sir. I request Professor J.S.R. Prasad Garu, Head Department of Sanskrit Studies, to take his seat on the dais. I request Professor Amba Kulkarni Madam to please take her seat on the dais. And thank you so much for the patience. And today we begin the program with the lighting of the lamp. Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya. The lamp dispels the darkness of ignorance. I invite the students from our department, Miss Vasudha and Miss Neha, to recite the invocations while the lamp is being lighted. I invite all the guests to come together and join in the lighting of the lamp.
शिवशक्त्या युक्तो यदि भवति शक्तः प्रभवितुं न चेदेवं देवो न खलु कुशलः स्पन्दितुमपि अतस्त्वामाराध्यां हरिहरविरिञ्चादिभिरपि प्रणन्तुं स्तोतुं वा कथमकृतपुण्यः प्रभवति तनीयां सम्पांसुं तव चरणपङ्केरुहभवं विरिञ्चिः सञ्चिन्वन् विरचयति लोकानविकलं वहत्येनं शौरिः कथमपि सहस्रेण शिरसां हरः संक्षुद्यैनं भजति भसितोद्धूलनविधिम् हरः संक्षुद्यैनं भजति भसितोद्धूलनविधिम् जगज्जालपालं कचत्कण्ठमालं शरच्चन्द्रभालं महादैत्यकालं नभोनीलिकायं दुरावारमायं सुपद्मासहायं भजेऽहं सदाम्भोधिवासं गलत्पुष्पहासं जगत्सन्निवासं शतादित्यभासं गदाचक्रशस्त्रं लसत्पीतवस्त्रं हसच्चारुवक्त्रं भजेऽहं रमाकण्ठहारं श्रुतिवातसारं जलान्तर्विहारं धराभारहारं चिदानन्दरूपं मनोज्ञस्वरूपं धृतानेकरूपं भजेऽहं जराजन्महीनं परानन्दपीनं समाधानलीनं सदैवानवीनं जगज्जन्महेतुं सुरानीककेतुं त्रिलोकैकसेतुं भजेऽहं जगज्जालपालं कचत्कण्ठमालं शरच्चन्द्रभालं महादैत्यकालं नभोनीलकायं दुरावारमायं सुपद्मासहायं भजेऽहं सुपद्मासहायं भजेऽहं सुपद्मासहायं भजेऽहं
Thank you, sir. We begin our program now with the welcome address by Dean School of Humanities, Professor V. Krishna Garu.
Dignitaries on the dais, respected Vice Chancellor, Professor B.J. Rao Garu, great visionary and poetess, Rajkumari Indira Devi Dhanrajgiri Garu, today's speaker, present day intellectual, Jainite, Sudipta Kaviraj Garu, Department of Sanskrit, head of the department, Professor J.S.R. Prasad Garu, Professor Amba Kulakarni Garu, all my friends. I think this is not the right time to deliver or speak much. Just I welcome you all for this important and thought-provoking presentation by Professor Sudipta Kaviraj Garu on 5th Puruṣārtha. That is very important. I am sure you will enjoy. Really, we will start after hearing to him scientifically, analyzing what Puruṣārtha exactly. Thank you very much for giving this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon to all of you. It's a very special privilege and also a pleasure for me to be here, to be welcoming Srimati Rajkumari Indira Devi Dhanrajgiri Garu. This is my first meeting her. I have seen her in portraits, I have read about her, but this is in-person meeting, first time for me. I also want to welcome Professor Sudipta Kaviraj Garu, who is right now at Columbia University in New York, and he is present with us in person, which is a real blessing for us. Thank you. And my colleagues on the dais, Krishna Garu, and my senior colleagues from the Sanskrit department, and all of you here. This is a real, very unique occasion to be commemorating Sri Gunturu Sheshandra Sharma Garu and to be part of this endowment lecture series in Sanskrit. Srimati Indira Devi Garu has been connected with us in an umbilical manner. She has given occasions for us to celebrate a lot of people through endowment lectures, which is a very important association of University of Hyderabad with her, and I am deeply indebted to her for these kind gestures that she has done to the university. I do not want to belabor this point too much because her blessing to the University of Hyderabad is very deeply appreciated. The center focus for today is Gunturu Sheshandra Sharma Garu, a very unique personality in post-independent India. Very unique because he culminated literary talent, especially the poetic talent, and a vast range of intellectual spread. I have not read his works myself, but I have heard about his works. I have read about his works, and the range of his spread was immensely impressive. In fact, his work, magnum opus work, Na Desham Na Prajalu, was a modern long piece of poetry on evoking a national conscience towards social liberation. And I came to know, I heard that he was nominated for Nobel Prize for this. The only second person to have been nominated, the first person being Gurudev Rabindranath Ji, who won the prize. Guntur Sheshendra Sharma Garu was the only second person who was nominated for his magnum opus work. And his 25 essays book on various subjects such as ancient Sanskrit, ancient Greek drama, comparative literature, classical poetry, and Sri Aurobindo's Savitri. That kind of spread is very hard to find. And he was the genesis for that kind of spread in the literary work. He was also a very deep critic. I am not the right person to actually go into the details of his works, but some of us have been exposed to his works, not directly in Telugu, but in other translations, mostly in English. So his spread was not only broad, but also quite deep in terms of thoughts. So celebrating him in the University of Hyderabad is a special blessing for us, and celebrating him through our esteemed guest who is going to give the endowment lecture is another special privilege for all of us. Thank you very much, and I wish to see such proceedings in the University of Hyderabad campus more in frequency and more in spread in future. Thank you very much and all the best. Namaste.
Thank you, sir, for sparing time in spite of your grueling schedule and enlightening us about the greatness of Sri Gunturu Sheshendra Sharma Garu. I now invite Professor Amba Kulkarni ji to give an introduction about the speaker of the day. Ma'am.
Thank you. So, Honorable Vice Chancellor, respected Professor, respected Rajkumari Indira Devi Dhanraj Girji, Dean Professor V. Krishna, Head Professor Prasad, and today's distinguished speaker, Professor Sudipta Kaviraj. Welcome to all. I'm very happy to welcome Professor Sudipta Kaviraj here and introduce him here. It's really my privilege to introduce him. Professor Kaviraj, as you know, is from Columbia University. He is the professor of Indian politics and intellectual history at the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian and African Studies. Prior to this, he was at JNU and then at the School of Oriental and African Studies at London. He had visiting fellowships and professorship at several prime institutions across the world. More important is he is a foremost theorist of Indian intellectual history and society. It is a privilege for us, and especially the Department of Sanskrit Studies, whose objective is not just to teach Sanskrit as a language, but to introduce to the students the rich Indian intellectual tradition encoded in Sanskrit and show the relevance of these knowledge systems in the present context. Professor Kaviraj's visit and today's talk fits very well with the department's vision. Professor Kaviraj is a prolific writer with a wide range of interests, including literary criticism and examining contemporary politics. For the first time, I came across Professor Kaviraj's writings in relation to Sanskrit Knowledge Systems Project, where, as a response or a sequel to Professor Sheldon Pollock's most provocative article, The Death of Sanskrit, Professor Kaviraj wrote on the sudden death of Sanskrit knowledge, where he examines the emergence of new trends in various disciplines such as Nyaya, Vyakarana, and Alankar Shastra and so on, Rasa Shastra, during the 17th century. He spent a considerable part of his childhood in Calcutta, especially and also in Navadvip, which is again very well related to Chaitanya Prabhu, where a Vaishnava cultural ethos influenced him. This provides a small context for his today's talk on the fifth Puruṣārtha. Professor Kaviraj is not a new face for our university. Many of faculty and students from the political science department know him very well. He had been visiting us earlier also. So I once again welcome Professor Kaviraj for this August gathering. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. I invite Professor Kaviraj to deliver the endowment lecture, the fifth Puruṣārtha, the lecture that we have been waiting for so eagerly.
Thank you very much for this invitation to deliver the Guru Sheshendra Sharma memorial lecture. It is a great honor for me to be associated with his name. I think there is some appropriateness in that connection, in the sense that some of the things that I'm going to discuss today would also connect with some of his enthusiasms about vernacular Sanskrit. A way of making our tradition, including very old ancient tradition of things like the Mahabharata, come alive again in modernity. So he was one of the authors of the modern Mahabharata. So I think this is something which is very central to my concerns. So I would not talk to you as a Sanskritist. I'm not a Sanskritist. I can read a little bit of Sanskrit and I have some enthusiasm about essentially two parts of the enormous expanse of the Sanskrit tradition. The first is the philosophical aesthetics of the Kashmiri Saiva, which they developed from the 8th to the 10th century, which I consider to be one of the greatest traditions of philosophical thinking about aesthetic questions in the history of the world. So I'm interested in that, not because it is Indian or not because it is my tradition, because I think it is something which needs to be seen as one of the greatest philosophical elements of the heritage of aesthetic thought in the world itself. The second thing which interests me very deeply is the thinking of the Gaudiya Vaiṣṇavas. I was familiar with the Gaudiya Vaiṣṇava thinking from a certain point of view from very early on. Since I went to a Bengali medium school, part of our training in Bengali literature familiarized us with the great tradition of Vaishnava Padavali poetry. But more recently, thinking about other things, thinking about more important philosophical questions, I started reading two Vaishnava texts, technical Vaishnava texts of Vaishnava theology. One is the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, and the other one is called the Ujjvala Nilamani, which is about essentially about Krishna and how the image of Krishna should be constructed. So much of my discussion today would be based on those two texts. I don't want to go into the textual part very well, but I want to link it to some concerns for me as a social theorist, as somebody who wants to understand the historical evolution of human society. So I'll make three quick remarks, quick observations, and then try to connect my argument with that. The first observation is that there's a tradition of thinking about our own tradition, which prefers to see this tradition as static, a tradition which does not evolve very much or change during history. This has two versions. One is an Orientalist version, which is best expressed by Hegel, for instance, in the philosophy of history. So I would like to make three observations at the start and then go into the discussion about Kashmiri thought and Vaishnava thought. The first observation is the idea that our tradition, though it is great, it is something which has not changed very much. There are two versions of this idea. One is an Orientalist version of this idea, which sees this as a fault. Hegel, for instance, thinks that while Europe has history, India actually comes from a cold part of the world where there is no history. So because of that, if you want to understand modern India, it's enough for you to understand what ancient India was. Because there's just lapse of time, which does not lead to any kind of structural alteration or change. So they see it essentially as a failure of the Indian civilization or fault of the Indian civilization. Ironically, on the other side, people who have a heavily romantic view of the Indian, particularly the Hindu tradition, they also have a belief in an unchanging tradition. But their argument is the opposite. Their argument is that the tradition is so perfect from the very start, from the time of the Vedas or the Upanishads, etc. It did not change simply because it need not. Because everything that was valuable in that tradition was already there, at least in a kind of inchoate state from the very first. What I would like to do would be to encourage us, including myself and particularly social scientists, to try to go into the history of Indian thought in search of ruptures, not in search of continuity. I do not mean by that there are no continuities. I think there are significant continuities. But I think there are certain things which would come alive to us, would become much clearer if we see that history as a history of rupture rather than continuity. The second observation is that in the very recent period, let's say over the last 20 years, there's been a lot of speculation among historians and intellectual historians about what is sometimes called a period of the early modern, an early modern period. The argument is that we should not, in India, work with this casual, essentially unthought out, uncriterial understanding of three periods of human history, the ancient, medieval, and modern. I call it uncriterial because, to use ancient, medieval, and modern, you do not actually need any special critical criteria. It's a kind of slapdash division of time. Now, against that, some historians, including Sheldon Pollock, who is a close friend of mine, have argued that there is a distinct period from the 16th to the 18th century in India, all over India, which should be classified as an early modern period. There are two parts to this argument. I would like to come to that later on if you want, during the discussion. The first part of the argument that there is a distinctive period from the 16th to the 18th century. And the question is that credible or not? The second part of their argument is that some of the features that we get in this distinct period remind us of some of the features that emerge in the early modern period in Europe. So that's why this is a period which is an early modern period in Indian history, but something which predates and therefore has nothing to do with the colonial period and the colonial offer of modernity. I think it's a very interesting argument. I don't want to get into this now. I agree with the first part. I think there's a distinctive period from the 16th to the 18th century which needs to be identified and, more important for me, to be named. And I do not agree with the naming of the early modern because I don't think a period of our history should be simply named by pointing out that it reminds us of something in European history. Anyway, and the third provocation, which is very recent, I read a book by a JNU political scientist, political theorist, Manindra Thakur, who has written a book in Hindi recently, which is called Gyan Ki Rajniti. the politics of knowledge. And one of the arguments that he makes in that book is that there's a lot of discussion in that book about the concept of human nature. But he makes a very intriguing argument at the end. He says that, if you look at the great political theories of the West, starting from Hobbes to Bentham, Mill, etc., there's constant discussion about what is the human nature, what is the nature of human beings generally. And they try to capture that through a great variety of presentations of their conceptions of human nature. Manindra's argument is that in India, we should experiment now by following people like Gandhi. Gandhi does not do it systematically, but there are suggestions in Gandhi that in India, when we try to think about politics and society, we should try to think through our own categories of human nature, because we have a very long-standing tradition of thinking of human nature in terms of four categories, the four Puruṣārtha categories. You can think of three vargas, that is the dharma, artha, kama, as three vargas or three Puruṣārthas, and also moksha. For me, moksha is very important. It will become clear as I go along. So the four Puruṣārthas. And Manindra's argument is that we should try to mobilize the conception of the four Puruṣārthas in trying to rethink problems of social and political thought in Indian terms, and he thinks that this would be one way of moving forward. I have great admiration, and expectation from an exercise of that kind, but I also have a disagreement with Manindra, because I would not agree with the supposition that thinking about the Puruṣārthas remained limited to those four, dharma, artha, kama, and moksha, for the entirety of the history of pre-modern India. And this is why I chose this slightly provocative title. The Vaiṣṇavas have saying, which is prema pumartho mahan. Pumartha is Puruṣārtha. So the argument there is that don't forget that prema, love, in the widest sense of the different interacting forms of human affection, this is also a great Puruṣārtha. Don't forget about it. So by implication, if you forget the fifth Puruṣārtha, then your understanding of what a human being is and what he is supposed to be doing here would be faulty. Now, so my argument would be essentially in 2-3 parts. I'll spend most of the time developing this idea of the difference between a conception of an ideal life which thinks of moksha as the ideal, moksha is the thing which is the purpose of our life, and a form of thinking which thinks moksha is not the purpose of our life. And in Vaishnava thinking, this is presented, to my mind, very beautifully, both philosophically very powerfully and poetically very beautifully, by the contrast between vaikuṇṭha, which is the place where Vishnu exists, and Vrndāvana, where Krishna exists. And I want to develop this argument a bit more. So, the first point, I'll make it cryptically. You will see that this is a very broad, general argument. I can't do justice to it in a single lecture. But basically what I'm saying is that if you look at the Hindu side, or the Indic side, whatever you want to call it, of our religious tradition, there's a great deal of thinking about, philosophical thinking about the meaning of human life, and what are the conceptions around which we can get to that. And we can find distinctive stages in this. I think we find this stage in the Upanishad, where there's a lot of ritualistic thinking, but there's also a lot of philosophical and poetic wonderment about the universe. So that is one stage. I personally think that the Kashmiri Saiva from the 8th to the 10th century make a huge intervention in two fields of philosophical thought. One is, of course, in aesthetics, and the other one is the general thinking about what are the ends of human life. And there's a connection between the aesthetic side and the general thinking about human life. If I summarize what these people ultimately say is that they believe there's a great focus on the reflection of the nature of art. What is art? And what does art give us in human life? And their elevation of art into something which is the most important thing in human life I'm not exaggerating because, one locution, one phrasing of this is they would say that art is the swada of poetry or the swada of art is Brahma swada sahodara. That is, it is identical or it is similar to the taste of being with God or knowing God. So it is Brahma swada sahodara. And if it is that, obviously there can't be anything which is more important than that, right? So it is the most important thing in human life. And why is it important? And if you look at they elaborate that argument by asking us to look at what happens in the theatre. After all, the commentary by Abhinava Gupta is about the Natya Shastra. And the Natya Shastra is about Natya, theatre, or art in the broadest sense. But they make a point about your being in the theatre, which I think is quite crucial for their argument. So they would say that when you are in the theatre, you are, again, to quote, the quotations that I am giving you, these are not from Abhinava, these are actually from the book called Sahitya Darpanam, which comes much later, but it's a kind of compendium of aesthetic theory. So he says that when you are in the theatre, suppose we are in a theatre hall watching an engrossing film, and we are 20 minutes into the film. So he would describe our condition 20 minutes into the film, that is, once art has grasped us, art has got us in its grip, either through poetry or through drama or whatever else. They would say that you are Vedyantara Sparsha Shunya. That is, Vedya is perceptible, anything that you can perceive, right? Vedyantara Sparsha Shunya means that you are in a condition where you have no other competing perceptible. You cannot be touched by anything, no other perception. So you are so completely enveloped in that no other perception can actually touch you. So the argument is an argument of intensification both of the value of art and also the intensification of human experience through art itself. So it's basically saying that human experience can be varied. We can have different kinds of experiences, but the most serious, the most valuable, because the most intense experience that we have is the experience of being subjected to the presence of art. That is the taste of art, and that is why they would actually always use the term aswada, swada. It touches you, but it touches you in a way like food or like a drink by going inside you and transforming your entire, perceptible environment. But in spite of that, even Abhinava Gupta, I'm totally unqualified admirer of Abhinava Gupta's philosophical thinking. I think he's probably the greatest, certainly one of the greatest theorists of art that humanity ever produced. But in spite of that, I find something which is remarkable, even about Abhinava. That is, if you look at the implication of this and ask, what are the Kashmiris saying? The Kashmiris are saying that in human life, most intense and the most transcendent-like experience is the experience of art. But the experience of art must be transient, right? I cannot live my whole life sitting in a theatre. I cannot live my whole life, however much I like Tagore, and I would like to live my whole life, at least the rest of my life, reading Tagore, but I cannot, right? So, if that is the most intense and transcendent experience that human beings can have, right? But it's an experience which cannot be continued for the whole of your life. Then what does it do to the remainder of your life, which you still have to live? Or if you put it in their language, which you still have to endure, right? So that life, ordinary human life, mundane human life, of ordinary experience, is not something which is transformable into a form of transcendence by art itself. So art is a respite. The art is an interval where you can be something much more than what you normally are. But art is not something which can envelop your life completely. You can go into art, but you have to come back, right? And because of that, even the Kashmiri Saivas would argue that the real purpose of human life is to try to be like God, right? So they would say, they have a very beautiful term, Prakya, that is your, you know, enlightenment essentially means that you come to realize that you are God Himself, which is not true in the ordinary sense. It basically means that there is so much of godliness implicit but unused in a human being, that the human being, through cultivation, first of all through awareness and cultivation that I have this capacity in myself, and then in trying to develop that capacity, right, I can actually, through 16 different stages, become something like God Himself. So merging with God is not actually going somewhere and merging with a great light, that kind of thing. Merging with God essentially means that you achieve godliness in yourself, right? And you become one with God. But even in there, that is a kind of, a cultivation of human abilities, cultivation of human skills. But in spite of that, in most of the previous traditions, there is a conception of something like being with God in Svarga, in paradise. I'll simply stick to, I won't go into the Shaivite side so much. I'm concerned more with the Vaishnava side. So the Vaishnavas have a very similar conception of being with God. Vaishnavas elaborate that much more. They would think of 6 different forms in which you can say that you are one with God if you are a really good bhakta, like Sarshti, Sarupya, Sayudhya, etc., etc. But your purpose is to go to Vaikuṇṭha. Vaikuṇṭha is where Vishnu exists. I personally feel that in the later form of Vaishnavism, of which I'm more familiar with the Gaudiya side, so that's why I will spend the rest of my time talking about the Gaudiya Vaiṣṇava theology. I think they are doing something which is incredibly important and radical and ruptural. I'll simply, as an example, without going into too much of the technical theological disputation, I'll give you an artistic explanation, artistic example of Vaishnava thinking. There's a song, I think it comes from a Marathi poet, but it was sung by Pandit Jasraj quite often. I used to like hearing him sing that. It's a short song, but this song counterposes Vaikuṇṭha with Vrndāvana. This song is about Vrndāvana. So the song says, Kaha karu, that is, kya karu? Kaha karu, Vaikuṇṭha mein jaye. I think Sanjay might have heard this song with me sometime. Kaha karu, Vaikuṇṭha mein jaye. What shall I do by going to Vaikuṇṭha? Coming from a Vaishnava. And the reason why he doesn't want to go to Vaikuṇṭha, I think, are very important. Jaha nahi Nanda, yaha nahi Yashoda. So, you do not have, Krishna doesn't have his adoptive parents, right? Not his parents, not Vasudeva and Devaki, but yaha nahi Nanda, yaha nahi Yashoda. So, the love that only parents can give you, right? Because every form of love in human life is very specific. It can come only from a certain set of people, a certain group of people. A certain group of people who bear a certain kind of structured relationship with you. So the love that I get from people who are older than me, like my parents or my parent friend, that's a specific kind of love. So yaha nahi Nanda, yaha nahi Yashoda. Yaha nahi Gopi, of course, because it is a Vaishnava song. Yaha nahi Gopi, where you do not have your lovers. Gwalana, that is the cowherd, who are Krishna's friends. Yaha nahi Gopi, Gwalana, Gai, that is also the cattle. So I don't want to go to Vaikuṇṭha because Vaikuṇṭha does not have Nanda and Yashoda. It doesn't have the Gopis. It doesn't have the friends who are the cowherd with Krishna, and which doesn't have the cattle, right? Jaha nahi Yamuna ke jala niramala, that is where you don't have the clear water of the Yamuna, And yaha nahi kadamba ke chhaya. That is where you do not have the shade of the kadamba tree. Now, I read it this way. I'm essentially a social theorist. And to me, this song basically says something like this, that um, searching for paradise is not searching for an escape from human life, not even an escape from human life, which exists for just 2 hours inside the theater, where something incredibly powerful, something incredibly beautiful happens. And it completely mesmerizes you so much that you lose the world for a few hours. Even that is not paradise. So paradise is a place here. Paradise is not a place outside the world. Paradise is a place from which, a human place, from which human suffering has been absent. Uh, Paradise is a place in human life where there is no human suffering. And the fullness of human life, that is, life which doesn't have suffering, has these features. That is, you would be enveloped by the love of your parents, the love of your lover, the love of your friend, right? Uh, the animal, the animal life which interacts with you and which sustains you as part of the nature, in which you live. So the cattle being there is absolutely essential, which Vaikuṇṭha does not have. And I overinterpret the sentence, Jahanai Jamuna ke Jala Niramala. I'm actually giving you a kind of summary of a chapter of a book I have written very recently in Bengali, which has a chapter on this, and I have some discussion about it there. What I've said there about the Jahanai Jala Jamuna ke Niramala is, I've said that, Niramala is not water which has not been contaminated. It's not pure water. And Professor Kulkarni and other Sanskritists would bear with me, because I feel that when I read Abhinavagupta, for instance, I find that there's a kind of extreme philosophy of interpretation which appeals to me very much. So he would very often say that even if you have words which seem like fillers, like a he or eva or something like that, sometimes we feel that it has been put there simply to rhyme, uh, simply to bring the two different sentences into some kind of rhythmic pattern. Abhinava usually refuses that. He says that, if you really think that your author is a great author, you must try to gloss that. So that's what I'm trying to do. But so my feeling is that, when you say that Jamuna ke Jala Niramala, Niramala is not water which is uncontaminated. It's water which has been purified. Because it's, after all, it's a metaphor for the experience of human life. That is the water. So experience of human life is not that you can practice a certain kind of innocence so successfully that the water of your life would never be dirty, right? So you need something which is a purified water, in the sense that a water from which the dirt has been cleansed somehow through some kind of practice. So that in the metaphorical key, it's the experience of your life from which the dregs somehow have been cleansed. The suffering had been cleared out in a certain sense. So that is Jamuna ke Jala Niramala. And finally, Jahanahi Kadamba ke Chhai. And Kadamba ke Chhai, obviously there are two sides to it. One is the Chhaya, the shadow that the Kadamba tree gives us, which is sustenance. This again a metaphor for nature, it's sustenance. But Kadamba is also a very beautiful tree. If you have seen the Kadamba tree, every leaf of the Kadamba tree seems like being sculpted individually. It seems like a sculpted leaf. So it is a combination of both sustenance, chaya, and beauty, right? So these are the things that we need in a human life, and this is what we need. This is why we need a Vrindavan and not a Vaikuṇṭha. So the song, to my mind, I'm sorry that I've actually given you a rather simple seeming song. I don't think it's a simple-minded song. I think it's a very deep song, but it is simple in that sense. But I use that because I think captures beautifully and very poignantly what is the central argument of this philosophy. So, what is the central argument of this philosophy and what is the implication? What I'm trying to argue with you is that because of the influence of Weberian sociology sometimes, and directly Weber himself, he sometimes repeats this idea that Indian religion, particularly Hindu religion, is too otherworldly. It's too otherworldly. So whatever it does, it gives you very detailed rules of social life. It gives you sometimes in a different mood. It gives you very sophisticated rules of self-examination and ethical self-awareness and things like that. But basically, it's an otherworldly religion. It asks you that eventually you have to detach yourself from the world. There's nothing that can redeem this world, from its wretchedness. So the human experience is a wretched experience, after all, in spite of everything. And you should be happy that you leave it behind, right? Now, I think the Vaiṣṇava thesis about human life, the substitution of vaikuṇṭha with Vrndāvana, and this is linked to the two figures, the figure of Vishnu and the figure of Krishna. You cannot think of Krishna in any other context, any other sort of imagic context, except for Vrndāvana. I think this is what this particular intervention in theological thinking does. And I would give you just one single sentence, which is textual. The Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, in the very early part, it tries to define what is bhakti. And it also has a famous sentence, famous shlok in which it defines what is uttama bhakti. Right? But in trying to define what bhakti is and why you should be affiliated to bhakti, it very often uses a phrase like, this is a phrase that the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu uses. It says, bhakti is moksha laghuta karini. Moksha laghuta karini. Bhakti is something which actually makes moksha itself insubstantial. It makes moksha laghu. It reduces the gurutva of moksha. So it is something which is superior to moksha in that way, moksha laghuta karini. So that's why I thought that I would give this title to my talk today, that it is the fifth Puruṣārtha. So the fifth Puruṣārtha is prema. The fifth Puruṣārtha is prema. And I now want you to consider some of the implications of this. What I presented to you very simply, it has behind it, it has associated with it, let me change the phrase, it has associated with it two very large corpuses of writing. One is the corpus of philosophical writing. And in my Bengali book, I say that one of the peculiar things about the Indian culture is that even if you are making an anti-intellectualist argument, you must make it in an intellectualist form. So essentially, I think the Bhakti argument is an anti-intellectualist in some ways, in that narrow sense, an anti-Brahminical kind of argument. But it has to be made in a language which is the technical language of Sanskrit philosophy. And the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu particularly is engaged in doing that. Now, but I think the implication of that is that it makes an intervention in thinking about the ends of human life, the most important question of human existence, by making a suggestion which is a ruptural suggestion. It's, to my mind, it's a basic rupture, with rupture meaning not in the modern sense. The modern sense would say that it's a revolution, everything earlier has been sort of set aside and left behind. Those ruptures are not like that. They continue a whole lot of things, and in my book, I show to what extent the Vaiṣṇava Goswamis mastered, the philosophy of the Kashmiri theorists. They have completely ingested the entire philosophical discussion about rasa and rasa theory. But the Kashmiris have no sense of a bhakti rasa. For them, saying that bhakti is a rasa would not make any sense. Rasa is something which happens in art. Rasa is something that happens in literature. Now, they mastered that philosophical tradition, but they put it to a completely different, innovative use. And my own sense is that that innovative use is very, very this-worthy. It's a very this-worthy use of that argument. And because of that, I think the figure of Radha, which is the most interesting, most arresting figure in this entire literary tradition, the figure of Radha is central. And I would make just 2 or 3 points very quickly, just to illustrate to you and suggest to you. I'm not, as I said, I'm not a Sanskritist, but to suggest to you that probably, these are some things which are happening through this major intervention. Think of even the term bhakti. There are different models of bhakti in the Indian tradition. Ram and Hanuman, for instance, would be one kind of bhakti. Ram and Lakshmana would be one kind of bhakti. These are relationships of bhakti in a certain sense. But think of the relationship between Krishna and Radha. It's nothing like that. Nothing like that. To my mind, it's a completely different way of thinking about bhakti, right? And if you see what is important there is that, I'm opposed to the idea of using terms like liberty or equality in cases like this. So I cannot say, in fairness, I think if I'll look at it closely, that the relationship between Radha and Krishna is equal. Equality comes from a completely different language of modern times. But it is a relationship of great mutuality and reciprocity. That is, one simply cannot exist, which means one simply cannot be what he is or what she is without the other presence as a condition for that. Right? So there is a deep mutuality in this, which is being introduced into the concept of bhakti. So I want to argue with you that we should, first of all, say, I'll go back to the point with which I started. I'll give you an example of how we can interpret it in 2 different ways. I greatly admire the work of a Bengali scholar, Nrsimha Prasad Bhaduri. He's a great scholar of Sanskrit, of the Mahabharata. He also has a very interesting essay from which I learnt a lot about the Vaishnava tradition in Arindam Chakravarti's Bloomsbury Handbook of Indian philosophical aesthetics. But there is one point that he makes there with which I disagree, which is the central point of my argument today. He says, making the same remark, that look at how well the Vaisṇava Goswamis mastered the philosophical aesthetics of the Kashmiri, of the rasa theory. I totally agree with him. But then he says, he follows it up by saying, so therefore, the work of the Goswamis like Rupa Goswami or Jiva Goswami, particularly Rupa Goswami, is essentially a culmination of what had happened in Kashmiri thinking before. I do not agree with that. I think to see it as a culmination is essentially to reduce the innovativeness of the Vaishnava intervention of the 15th, 16th, 17th century. So I personally feel that these are the reasons why we should give attention to this Vrndāvana centered, Krishna Radha centered, particularly Radha centered Vaishnava Bhakti, because what it does, let me give you 2 further arguments about what it does at that time and what it does later. I've argued in my book that something like what Vaishnava Bhakti does in the 16th century could not have happened if it was not pushed by 2 great engines in a certain sense, 2 great forces which are utterly dissimilar in their nature. One is the power of philosophical reasoning, the kind of philosophical reasoning that you get in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, and the philosophical elaboration of the Vaishnava tradition. Right? It could not have done it either without the force of the great poetic efflorescence which this kind of Vaishnavism gives rise to. On the one side, Jayadev, Vidyapati, the Bengali Vaishnava tradition, entirely, fueled by this totally different form of religiosity. And I think what is interesting about this religiosity, this is something that I'm borrowing entirely almost from Tagore. Tagore has a very famous poem which is called Vaisṇava, the Vaisṇava poetry. And he begins humorously by saying that is it true that all this poetry by the Vaisṇavas is essentially about gods? It doesn't say anything about our own lives, human life. And his argument is that it is essentially a celebration of human life under the pretense of celebration of divine love between Radha and Krishna. Now, this is a very important point because I find that the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, if we want to go into a technical discussion, I think the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu is very tense, extremely concerned about this. And repeatedly you get an admonition, you get a warning that don't take it literally. Don't take what Radha and Krishna are doing literally. Don't do it in your real lives. This is something which is completely metaphorical, right? So you have the philosophical argumentation, but also with this warning on the one side. But I personally feel that the poets, so I feel that once the Radha-Krishna complex is created, there is a tussle going on between the philosophical side and the poetic side. The philosophical side wants to keep it philosophical, arcane, philosophically extremely complex, but also very hard to get, right? And if you don't know Sanskrit, then of course you have no hope of understanding even 2 sentences of that, right? So it is very, very, very intellectualized in many different ways. On the other side, the force of the poetry is coming from the fact that it is in the vernacular. Think of somebody like Vidyapati, right? It's in the vernacular. And it has the power of the vernacular in both these senses. The power of the vernacular of easy intelligibility and easy contact with our own everyday language of emotion. That, the language that we have of our own emotions, because we can be in touch with our own emotions only through language. And that language is essentially the visceral language of the vernacular. So the poets use that language. And I personally feel that the history of Vaisṇava thought later on is a history of a contest between the philosophical interpretation and the poetic interpretation. The philosophical interpretation wants to keep it philosophical, metaphorical, something which should not touch human life. But the poetic interpretation essentially wants to turn it into primarily a celebration of human life and a divinization in a certain sense of human life. And so my own reading of this is that it's not surprising that after this theological system develops, it leads to the most astonishing explosion of music and poetry in all over India. Wherever this kind of Vaishnavism went, in South India, North India, everywhere, it immediately triggered a huge explosion of poetry. And so I actually see it as something which is comparable to what you find in the Renaissance in Europe. That is also a time where there is a great expression of religiosity. Think of the paintings by Raphael or paintings by Leonardo da Vinci. There is a deep religiosity expressed through that. But the religiosity is something which is also an affirmation of human life. It is not something which actually alienates religion from human life. So I personally feel, therefore, that our conclusion should be something like this, that we should look at the Indian tradition with curiosity and respect, because it's impossible that a tradition which has continued for 2000 years in the hands of considerable, big intellectuals, it hasn't produced something which has something to give to us even today. Just as the European tradition has all kinds of things which are, which are regrettable, which ought to be criticized and rejected. The same is true of our tradition. There are lots of things which should be criticized and rejected. But on the other side, there are certain things which are of deep value, from which we should not be alienated, simply because we have lost the language to be in touch with it, which is Sanskrit. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that, therefore, we should not agree with Hegel that India has no history or Indian thinking has no history. Indian thinking has quite obvious evidence of history. And that evidence can be brought out only if we do that history with, with an emphasis on looking for ruptures and innovation. The only problem is that sometimes the Indian tradition itself tries to hide its innovativeness. Abhinavagupta, for instance, has this very, very famous passage in which he says, Amnaya Siddhe, Kimapurvameta. What I am saying, everything is there in the Amna. There is nothing new in this. So everything that Abhinava says is right, except for this, because I think what he says in the name of Bharata, I think is one of the most astoundingly new creative interpretations of the Natya Shastra. So that's the second thing, that we should do a rupture of history of the Indian tradition of thought. Finally, coming back to the question of Sanskrit, I feel that colonialism has created a situation in our country where our past is perversely inaccessible to us. I use perversely because if among you who are the students, if you are a student in a Western country, which is much more modern compared to us in a certain sense, right? But if you said that I want to study the thinking of Xenophon, right? Not Aristotle, not Aristotle Plato, but Xenophon. You can go into a big university and there would be somebody who is specialist on Xenophon, right? And secondly, you would also have translations. There would be 3 translations of the same book by Xenophon, so that your access to what is there in the ancient tradition is very easy. So they are historically separated from their tradition, not intellectually in terms of access. In our case, it's the opposite. In many cases, we are historically close to our tradition, but we are intellectually completely separated because of the question of language and other things. So my plea to the people who are Sanskritic would be that you are actually the treasurer of something which is one of the most valuable parts of our history. And if it is not translated and made more accessible to people, then I think the restriction of Sanskrit would go on and we would lose this tradition. Therefore, I think the task of the Sanskrit is not to say that, I know Sanskrit and I can go into this treasure tradition and interpret it for you. I think the task of the good Sanskritist should be to say that I know Sanskrit, I know what is there, but I wanted to share in that. And it will take you some time to learn Sanskrit. So therefore, I would try to translate as much as I can of this so that it becomes accessible. So remember, I'm greatly influenced by Hegel, Marx, etc. I don't read German. So think of what would have happened if we could read Hegel only if we read German. Right? So I want the university system in our country to think closely and creatively about this and try to create conditions where just as, as a young person in Bengal reading political science, I got interested in Hegel and Marx, and I could read a lot of Hegel and Marx and about Hegel and Marx, all the discussion about Hegel and Marx in translation, right? Similarly, if somebody gets interested in some aspect of the Sanskrit tradition, it is something which is rendered accessible to them. I think it's only then that we can do something like this. It's only then that I think we can write many more books like the Adhunika Mahabharata, that is, making the Mahabharata not something which is treasured, but inaccessible, but making it something, which is treasured, but it's also something which is an open book to us. Thank you.
Helpful lecture, Professor Sudipta Kaviraj ji. I'm sure we all were curious about, what the 5th Puruṣārtha could be, and it was a very interesting day. Thank you so much, sir. Any questions to our distinguished professor today?
I would request the professor to tell us in a nutshell what is Puruṣārtha.
I think I'm not a good person to try. I'm not a Sanskritist, but I'll try. I'll try as a non-Sanskritist. There are two things about Puruṣārtha. Also, the Purusha and the Artha. Purusha, in a certain sense, is a horrible term. But if you inflect it a little bit, it is actually one of my Sanskritist friends would say that it is man embracing God. So in that case, of course, Purusha is an acceptable term. But Artha, the book that I mentioned by Manindra Thakur, he makes a remark when he says that we should try to think about social questions through the four Puruṣārtha, the Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha. He had slightly expanded sections on Kama and Artha. And to take one example, Artha is, like many other important Sanskrit terms, is a term with many meanings. And my Sanskrit teacher always said that when you try to understand anything in Sanskrit, you must understand what the distinct meanings are, but don't stop there. You must realize that the good Sanskrit users, they would use overlapping meanings. So they would, I'll give you an example from a song which I like very much, but in Bengali, a Tagore song. But it's an illustration of what my Pandit Moshe told me. Tagore has a song, it's one of his devotional songs, it's a song to God. It says, Boro Bedonar Mondo Bedecho Tomihe Amar Prami. This is the first line. It means that you have come into my heart like a deep anguish or deep pain. Now, the idea, of course, is very beautiful in some senses, but what is interesting in this respect is the use of the verb bedecho. Baja in Bengali has two meanings. Quite clear. Any child would know that baja means two things. One meaning of baja is to sound. So I do this. This is baja. So if you play an instrument, it is baja. And the other meaning of baja is to feel hurt. So if I step on a thorn, I would say pai bedecho. That is, my foot is hurt by the thorn. So baja has actually both these things. And look at how he uses it in that sentence to God. That you have come into my heart. He is not using come into. The word baja does that. But it means both that you have come into my life as a heart, but which also has a kind of musical sound. Right? So Artha also has several meanings. And Artha means purpose. I was finishing a paper for a friend of mine, and the title of the volume would be Ends of Life. And they wanted a version of this paper, so I wrote that. And I started thinking about it and felt that ends of life can be translated as Puruṣārtha, the end of life. But the interesting thing is that end in European languages, if you follow Aristotle, for instance, end is telos. That is, it is both the end of the process and it is also the purpose in which the process comes to its fruition and becomes realized. So they also have this dual meaning of the term end. In Artha, we have somewhat different dual meaning. One Artha is purpose, but the other meaning of Artha is also meaningfulness. So if you do this, then you can have your life becomes meaningful. So Puruṣārtha, that is how I see Puruṣārtha.
Any more questions for our speaker?
I'll ask you another question. Now, the child, does he feel the Puruṣārtha?
It's a great question. I think great question. And the great question is the question that can't be answered easily. Does the child
Does he feel the Puruṣārtha in him?
I think, let me make just 2 points very quickly, because I take it's not a question, I think it's a question and objection mixed together. Seriously. But I think it's a very important question. There's some discussion in some of the Sanskrit stuff that I have read, in which they ask questions like this. Suppose there is a small child who sees something blue, a blue cloth. So clearly he sees something. We cannot deny that he sees something. He wants to grasp it. Right? But the philosopher would ask, does he see something blue? So they would say, of course, in some senses, he must see something blue. How can he not see something blue? He is obviously not seeing something red. Sees something blue. But ultimately, some philosophers will say that the only difference between me and old man and the child is that I know the word, and I know the word. He doesn't yet know the word. So he cannot say kneel. I can say kneel, which has some implications, of course, because if I want to remind you of something which was kneel, then the word can do that. So the child cannot do that. But whether the child, so the question, however, would be, is the perception of Puruṣārtha something like the perception of color? Cannot be, because Puruṣārtha is a moral concept. Blue is a material concept of a material thing. But if you eyes on that, probably from some of the stuff that I have read, for instance, in commentaries on the commentaries on the Brahma Sutra, sometimes they go into some of these very arcane but wonderful, wonderful discussions. They would say that, if by Puruṣārtha you mean the realization of something which is of value, right? Then the child also has an understanding of something that is of value to him. So when he has food, when he has comfort from his mother, right, he must feel that this is something which is of value. Right? So in that sense, one could probably say that, as your life grows, your understanding of what a Puruṣārtha is grows. But it's not that you don't have it at one point and acquire it at
The sea was.
no.
One more question. Now, time. Does time play any part in realizing Puruṣārtha? Time, like years, living life, anything. Time.
I not say that it must, because in the sense that it might do in 3 ways.
Because you're growing older.
That's right. So your the range of perceptions that you have, particularly perceptions which are mediated intellectually, right? That grows. And secondly, the kind of experiences that you must have. There are certain types of experience that you cannot have when you are a child, but you have later. And finally, I think the Puruṣārtha related point would be that we also have the capacity to think back about an experience which has happened before. Yeah. So that would be another way in which we can probably do it. It's not a good answer, but because your question is a very good question.
Thank you so much. There's an answer there.
Yeah,
Come ask questions.
So you talk about aesthetics and how Raphael's work, was really an exploration of form and so on. Would you push this to say that there might have been some precursors to inquiring, because scientific realism, the notions also, the early notions are from the Renaissance, aren't they? Was there something similar happening in the Vaishnava celebration, or is it just confined to merely aesthetic experiences and so on. So I'd like to know what you feel about it. And another small remark regarding translation, right? While it's really important, as you said, to make these words accessible, largely, I don't know if you agree that these remain merely of an interest in terms of its antiquity. But can it really fuse? Can it fuse into modern scholarship in a real sense than simply be looked at as, eloquent expositions of the past? So I just wanted to.
Thank you again. I think very, very good question. On the question of whether it's a very good question, because behind your question, at least let me interpret your question this way. This is something that I had discussed with Sheldon Pollock quite a lot during a project that we did which came out in a very big book, Literary Cultures in History. Quite often, but we were only discussing literature. Remember that, not art, not even art. A very narrow focus on literature. Quite often, for instance, I said to Shelley that Bengali Vaiṣṇava poetry shows something very interesting. If you see Jayadeva, of course it's very erotic, but essentially it's a highly physical understanding of human life. Right? Although initially, rather impishly, he has an introduction which I really like. He says, Yadi Hari Smarane Sarasang Manu. Right? That is, if your mind becomes saras by remembering Hari, or this is the impish side. He said, Yadi Vilasa Kalasu Kutuhalam. That you have curiosity about love play, purely erotic. So you have two reasons for coming to my book. But I think there is also the Tikakar would say that the meaning of this is that you can come through one door and go through the other door also. That you might be interested only in the sexual play. But ultimately this is a Vaishnava concept of your mind being dravita. That your mind being soaked or wet by the rasa of bhakti. But so I told him that Shelley, in Bengali Vaishnava poetry, suddenly you find something which is very different. Much of the time Krishna is mute. Krishna doesn't say a word. Right? The extremely loquacious poetic saying, language, the loquacious expression is all coming from Radha. Krishna is completely mute. In the Bengali Vaishnava poetry, I don't think I can actually think of even 10 sentences spoken by Krishna. Right? But of course, there is a deep philosophical and theological reason for that, because Radha is the representative of humanity. Radha is the devotee. So Radha is humanity, which is also, I think, a very interesting point, that making a woman the representative of humanity rather than a man, I think suggests in a certain sense, if you ascribe to them this kind of subtle and very powerful intelligence, that the negative experiences of human life, they recognize, are shared unequally between men and women. Right? So vulnerabilities and suffering of certain types are experienced by women much more. And so therefore, in a certain sense, it's absolutely philosophically justified to look for a woman as the experience of humanity, right, rather than a man. So I would say that there's a lot of writing about mental anguish, mental anguish, viraha, and things like that. Shelley would say, Sudipta, why isn't this modern? Right? And we ultimately concluded there were two reasons why it was not modern. I would also say third reason, that is, we should not look at European categories for everything. But leave that aside. That is both an important point, but it's also a slightly clever point. It's not a very substantial point. But 2 points. One of the points is closely linked to what you asked. The first point is that those things do not stabilize. They go on for some time, but after a century, you will find that there is a kind of weakening of that. And poetry, Vaishnava poetry continues. It's still a very powerful, productive literature, but it goes back more and more and more into an alankaric form. Where you have alliterative things and conventional imagery and things like that. And this, this more mentalist side, that is the development of a certain kind of, if not unique, a certain kind of subjectivity, that becomes muted. So it does not carry for long. That's one. And the other thing is, both of us saw that the whole point about European modernity is that it happens across the board, which is your point. Doesn't happen inside. I'm not well-read enough to say something about it, but let me make a point on the basis of somebody else's research, for whom I have very great regard. That is Jonathan Kennedy, the philosopher. He has a book which is called The Lost Age of Reason. Very well known, The Lost Age of Reason. I sometimes feel that, Jonathan exaggerates a little bit, but leave that aside. It's very likely that he is right and I'm wrong, because I'm making a judgment. But he is the one who can read the text. But what Jonathan shows me is that until the 17th century, in Navadvip, the town where I grew up, which is the center of Sanskrit learning, there are very considerable philosophers, particularly philosophers who are engaged in logic. There's somebody called Gadadhara, who is a major philosopher about semantic force. Jonathan's own book is called Semantic Force. It's on Gadadhara's exploration of where does the semantic force come from. So it's called Shaktivada. Very similar to discussions we have in modern European philosophy. But my feeling is that, Gadadhara is not a scientist. He's a logician. And my feeling is that you cannot say, is the Gadadhara type work weakening or disappearing? No, I don't think it would be right to say that. The major people, just before Gadadhara, probably a century before Gadadhara, there's another man in Navadvip who says, very late, that instead of 8 padarthas or 16 padarthas, he thinks there's 32 padarthas. And deep, forceful argument about 32 padarthas. So you cannot say that tradition is weak. But I think, the Galileo kind of thing, the Galileo type of thing, I don't see that here. And unless you have a combination of the Gadadhar type of thing with the Galileo type of thing, which is actually in physical science, then I don't think you can actually go in that direction. The second point, what was your second point?
It was about the utility of
Sorry?
whether that
Oh,
can get infused into modern scholars.
Let me give you an example. This is something that I'm taking from my teaching in Colombia. We were doing, Sheldon Pulak was doing, in the advanced Sanskrit course, he was reading a section from the Abhinav Bharati, the Rasa Sutra section, where the 2 lines of the Rasa Sutra, he had 30 pages on the elaboration of the Rasa Sutra. We were doing that. In that, there is a discussion about Sadharanika. Some image, in Sanskrit, they would say Sadharanik. What is Sadharanika? So, Shelley liked having me in the teaching there because, I could bring in arguments from modern philosophy. So I told him, Shelley, what is happening is like this. I've now just written a paper last year, which came out in Philosophy East and West. If you're interested, you can look at it. But this is an answer to your question. We were telling the students that the discussion is about, an actor is on the stage and he's impersonating Ram, right? So what is happening on this stage? Let us try to look at it more closely. So they would say that it's a wonderful, really wonderful discussion, that people are not invited to think that he is really Ram, right? That's not what people are meant to think. People are not meant to believe that who is this? He is not Ram. So he's an imposter who is walking on the stage. Why should I believe that he is Ram? Right? It is also not that he is like Ram. Why not like Ram? Who has seen Ram? How can you say that he is like Ram? In fact, you have never seen Ram. So how can you say that he is like? So even likeness doesn't work. So what works? The argument, then I think, is a wonderfully sophisticated argument. The argument is that Ram is, or Krishna is said to be in the text very handsome. Right? Very handsome is a very general description. Right? Now, you should not usually put somebody who is not a very handsome person to act as Ram, because that strains the imagination of your spectators. But anyway, so you put somebody who is a reasonably handsome man as Ram. But then Abhinava says, look at what is happening in the minds of the spectator. The mind of the spectator does something like this. So he sees, I would tell my American students that you see Tom Cruise as Ram. But you know that Tom Cruise is handsome, but handsomeness is a determinate thing. He has a particular form of the nose, as it is, etc. If we could see Ram, he would have had a different form of handsomeness. So it cannot be identical. So what is it? Abhinava's argument is that so every spectator, through that trigger, creates an image of Ram as the maximally handsome man in his own mind, right? And because he is the creator of that image, he can never fail to be charmed by that image, right? So it's not like a picture. If Leonardo has painted a face, and I say that, well, to Leonardo it might have been very beautiful, but I don't think that she's so lovely. You cannot do that, because it's your image that you are seeing in your own mind. But no one is seeing the image in somebody else's mind. This is Sadharanikaran. If we go into our English discussion about representation, think of even highly sophisticated thinkers like Gaudiya and others. They've actually written a lot about this. My paper goes into Gaudiya to some extent, and then it says that I get up to this in Gaudiya, but I find this in Abhinava, which is not there. So, what does it do? It gives you something which is very general, but very individuated at the same time. So, some of the pitfalls of generality or universality you completely avoid. But to avoid that, you have to do an argument which is so disintelligent. It's an exceptional argument about how you see an image. And my argument would be that this is not about the past. So when I teach this to my students in Colombia, I don't say that you see this, then you understand Abhinava. Of course I say that. But I say that you would understand Abhinava, but you would be able to explain to people what happens when somebody looks at theatre, or somebody looks at an image of Krishna somewhere, which no one else would be able to do. So the benefit is not an antiquarian benefit. The benefit is the instant benefit of knowledge, present knowledge. Sorry, I went on for too long.
Last
Because
question.
it was such a good question.
Last question.
Thank you, sir. Trying to philosophize the concept of Indian aesthetics is quite infusing good emotion. Undoubtedly, it is a good thing. But basically, Mansuran Saraswati's Ujjwala Neelamani and Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu and Rupa Goswami's Ujjwala Neelamani, both the texts were written to propagate the concept of bhakti. Earlier, it was not considered as bhakti was not considered as rasa before these people. So they tried to propagate even the bhakti also, after going through the writings of Jayadeva and Vilashoka, they conceptualized bhakti as important rasa. To propagate such type of thing, they wrote such type of things. You are comparing these two texts to the writings of Abhinav Gupta, undoubtedly Abhinav Bharati, to propagate how they made it to rasa. Certainly it was Bharata conceptualized only 8 rasas, but these people have given bhakti also and this thing. Generally, in our Indian this thing, rasa is one of the very important texts, and Abhinav Bharati and Abhinav Gupta also, especially Anandavardhana, after giving Dhvanyaloka, he says that Dhvani rasa, Dhvani and rasa, both the things should be there in a text. Then only it would be a wonderful text. That is what they want to propagate. And you are talking about Pratyabhijna. Pratyabhijna, I think it is more related to Shankaracharya's concept, Aham Brahmasmi, like that. You see yourself, what happens, Aham Brahmasmi. That was the major concept. We should relate it to, instead of relating to Kashmiri Shaivism, we should relate it to the Shankaracharya's concept. But basically, your conceptualization of the thing is quite interesting, sir. Thank you.
Very interesting point, sir. Just I wish to, as you highlighted the writings of Max Weber regarding one particular context, I also would like to invoke Louis Dumont's notion of Indian sociology as a confluence of Indology and sociology. So, looking from the methodological point of view, day by day, the Indian social scientists, they are trying to maintain distance from Indology, whereas the scholars of Western world are very much nearer to Indology. So I could see a kind of contradiction. So when I try to locate, I try to revisit the Telugu poems which I read as a child in my school days as well as in the college days, starting from Manucharitra to Gurum Joshua's Dabilam, that is the bat. Right, which primarily talks about the different types of bhakti rasas, which also invokes the different perspective we study as a part of social sciences. It would be subaltern studies. Let's say people like Sri Sri or Gaddar, they invoked the idea of subaltern studies in their poems. Right? Whatever the concept of humiliation talked by Gopal Guru, almost 100 years ago, Guru Joshua, in his famous poem, The Bat, he spoke in a very lengthy manner. So when I look at the entire Telugu literature in a chronological order, it gave us a lot of impetus to the sociological theory. But do you see that? Would you like to say that the alienation of the Indian scientists, Indian social scientists, from the Indological roots is the primary reason for a kind of accepting Western epistemological hegemony? Because we feel so happy that you are teaching some sort of Indology at Columbia University. But if we teach the same in sociology classroom, we will be treated as a traditionalist or conservative. So are we victims of Indology? Are we victims of ideology? Or are we victims of colonial anthropology? Yes, sir.
Very briefly, I think we're victims of all that. But I think, on the question of Indology and Orientalism, I think we need to make a distinction between two things. Now, obviously, a lot of the Indologists were Orientalists in a certain sense, but I don't think there's any necessary reason for an Indologist to be an Orientalist. So I think in our critique of Orientalism, we should not give up on the knowledge of Sanskrit or knowledge of the ancient, not just Sanskrit, Pali, medieval Persian, which is different from modern Persian, etc. So I think we should do that. And the other thing is that I have always felt something, which is as I grew up and I started taking interest in political theory, Of course, I read a lot of Marx, etc. But I kept on asking myself, uh, isn't there any writing of this kind in our literature, in Bengali, for instance? At that time, I was not so bothered about it. I learned a little bit of Sanskrit, but I was not concerned about these questions. And then it struck me suddenly that we have a lot of this kind of thing, thinking about these questions. What is modernity? What is the self? Is there an acceleration of history? What does that mean? All kinds of questions, which is central to modern social theory that I was reading there. But in Bengali or in Indian languages, those were actually inside literary texts, not theory texts, literary texts. And that's why, for instance, some of the literary texts, I'll give you an example from Bengal, but he's very popular in Andhra or in the Telugu region, Sharat Chandra Gaudiya. Right? Now, if you look at him, you will see that his writing is most of the time on something which is a deep social question. Deep social question. What is interesting is not merely that he takes a certain critical position towards, let's say, the way women are treated, the way widows are treated, and things like that. But what is remarkable about Sharat Chandra is the proportion between dialogue and what you might call assertoric sentences. In a sentence we describe something and the dialogue. Sharat Chandra's writing is full of dialogue. And what is the dialogue doing? If you look at the dialogue, you will see the dialogue is essentially a social theoretical debate between two fictional characters. And the greatest example of that is Tagore's Gora. If you read Gora, 500 pages. The 500 pages essentially between three characters. Three or four characters who are cardboard characters in a sense. They're not fleshed out characters in that sense. But they are the most important positions on the question of what religion means in Bengal at that time. So, I totally agree with you that if we really want to understand how our people have thought about social questions, we will probably get more out of literature than out of technical or formal social theory.
One question I have for you is moksha for you a state, a destination, or a geographic location?
The three Buddhas I do not know, but I'll try.
You could discuss them with our distinguished speaker over tea. Right now, we'll be concluding the program. I invite Professor J.S.R. Prasad Garu to deliver his vote of thanks and also a brief message to us. Thank you.
For that wonderful lecture. You mentioned that I am not a Sanskritist, but you have used so many Sanskrit terms. They are imprinted with a lot of concepts. So, you talked about the history of thought, the pre-modern history is essential in the sense of dharma, artha, kama, moksha, the Puruṣārthas. What Madam has asked the question, Puruṣārtha, what does it mean? Puruṣena archyate iti Puruṣārtha. It is being sought by the person. The word Purusha has a meaning like Puruṣena iti Purusha. Puru means the body. The one who dwells inside the body is called Purusha. That means in the gender sense. It is applicable to both male and female. So that is the highest level of human excellence, the Puruṣārthas. Another question what you asked is also very interesting, madam. Whether a child desires the Puruṣārthas. Yes, Satyam Vada, you speak the truth. Dharmam Chara, you follow the Dharma. These kind of injunctions are given to the child since from very childhood. So that the child is traveling on the path of Dharma. So we can unequivocally say that this is equal to all, the Puruṣārthas. And also, I just jump into the questions, of course. Sir, you have talked about the Brahmananda Sahodara. In fact, God is said to be called the actual Rasa, Raso Vaisaha, as Upanishad says. He is the form of embodiment of Rasa. Rasa in the sense of love. When love projected towards a world,
it is called love, L-O-V-E, love. Whereas it is projected toward the God or spirituality, it is called devotion. Same feeling. So such a way, actual Brahmananda is rasa, and the supernatural entity, if at all you believe, called God, is the Brahmananda. He is the Brahmananda also, because Anando Brahmayati Vijana. You talked about Natashastram, Sahitya Tarpanam, and nice quotations you have given. Vedyantara Sparsha Sunyam, because you are trying to project that how long the joy endures. That was the purpose of mentioning this particular quotation. All these entertainments, all the joys will not last long. What that lasts long is moksha in the context of Puruṣārthas. But as Dr. Sudipta rightly asked, moksha is liberation from all the worldly bonds. Moksha is not exactly going to heaven. There is no place like heaven, and you are roaming in the nice garden along with our kith and kin and wife and husband. It is not the case. You mentioned rightly about the word paradise. Paradise is here, inside the heart. And also you mentioned about the Gaudiya Vaiṣṇava Sampradaya. We can certainly remember the profounder of this particular tradition, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. He used to call as Gauranga. He was so much craving for the touch of the God. That is why the white sandal paste has been anointed on the body of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Within 10 minutes, it is getting fall off. Because so much heat is emitting from his body. Unless God comes and embraces him, that will not be pacified. Such a way is called Gauranga. The bhakti is, of course, fifth Puruṣārtha in their tradition. At the same time, bhakti essentially connotes the duality. Everybody says that Aham Brahmasmi. Everybody wants to get in the Advaita, Advaita philosophy. Everybody wants to embrace the Advaita philosophy. But here, they want to be in the dualism. So that they are seeing God as the other and they could be able to serve. There is a servant-master relation. And nice quotations, of course. Lack of time forces me to not to mention all the points that you have mentioned. One thing you also mentioned about the relation between Rama, Hanuman and Krishna, Radha. The relation between Rama and Hanuman is Sevya Sevaka Bhava, master-servant relation. Dasoham Kausalendrasya, as Hanuman says in Ramayana. With regard to Krishna and Radha, Radha is also a concept. Radha is not being mentioned anywhere in Bhagavatam. Anywhere in Bhagavatam. Her name is mentioned only in Vatsya Purana. But what do you mean by Radha is? Dhara. The stream of devotion is called Radha. That way, one who shows the devotion is called Radha. It is not one single individual. So this is how you try to portray the importance of bhakti, because in Sri Vaisṇava Sampradaya, they say that their soul is part of the limb of the God, the Sesha Seshi Bhava. When Madhva came, Madhva mentioned that both are different. You are not even a limb. Shankara told that you are Brahman, you are God, unless you realize. But when Ramanuja came, Ramanuja mentioned that you are part of a God. You are like hand, feet, etc. It's a limb, but it's not a total body. At the same time, when Madhva came and mentioned that you are nowhere related to God, total duality has been shown by the Madhva. In fact, that is correct for us. In what context Shankara has mentioned the Advaita philosophy, we need to see. Those times, the atheists were there, Nastikas. One side the Buddhists, other side Mimamsakas, who doesn't accept the existence of the God. This is where he has to say that you are God, to convince them. This is a logic that is based in many contexts. So that was a information-packed lecture. Thank you very much, sir, for giving this wonderful presentation to us. And we love to see many of our colleagues asking questions. Professor Ramal asked about Pratyabhijna. Pratyabhijna is again Shiva, Pashupati and Pasha. These three things only. That way there is a correlation. There is not much difference. And I would like to, after proposing vote of thanks to Professor Sudipta ji. I would like to thank our Vice Chancellor, though he stayed here very briefly. He has given a nice message to all of us. And our Dean, Professor V. Krishna, for all his support throughout the lecture, he is with us. Thank you very much, sir. And Professor Amba Kulkarni, without whom this lecture would not have been realized. So all credit goes to her from the department side. So thank you very much, madam, for pursuing with Professor Sudipta ji and making this lecture so successful. And I would like to thank all of our students, research scholars, project staff, guest faculty, and Dr. Vinaya, the visiting fellow, the department. Well, now I come to the actual important person of this particular function. In 2013, we have started this lecture series. Madam has graciously endowed some amount to conduct these lectures in the university. Several departments has been given the endowment. We also have been conducting these lectures since 2013. This is the lecture, this is the first lecture post-pandemic. So she kindly could able to come here and sit along with us. So nice to see you, madam, after a long time. We are really blessed with your presence. Thank you very much, madam. And also I would like to thank our office staff, Sri Ranjit and Srimati Mahalakshmi, for all the support given. And the staff from the Dean's office, Sri Suryanarayana, Sri Suresh Babu, Sri Srinivas, Ms. Geeta and others. And in the audience, eminent colleagues were sitting, Professor Bibin Srivastava, the ex-Pro Chancellor, and also I know some of the names, Professor Shashij Hegde, and I'm very sorry, I don't know some of the names of these senior colleagues sitting here. Sanjay Panshil, and Professor Sharath, and Professor Geeta ji from FLU University, she retired from FLU. Sri Deepa, Professor Ramalu, Professor Nagaraju, Professor Darlagaru, and all other colleagues for making this function great success. Last but not least, I would like to thank Mrs. Sudipta ji for her gracious presence amongst us. Thank you very much, madam. Thank you, one and all.